Okay, and as I've mentioned, a lot of the information war is carried out on the internet. But let's go back in time and just consider when it all started, really. If we go back 300 years and just consider, you know, what was it that first started programming people's minds with propaganda? We can say newspapers. 300 years ago, newspapers were invented. The problem with newspapers is that the information only goes in one direction. So whoever is publishing the newspaper, whoever has enough money or power to create it, has got huge control over people's minds. 80 years ago, there was a new technology came along, radio. But the problem with that was it did exactly the same. It sent information in one direction and one direction only. Then 50 years ago, the biggest propaganda tool ever invented came along. But again, information went in one direction. So it was just another propaganda exercise. 25 years ago, something different came along, which threatened the existing system, and that was the internet. And what the internet promised was to allow any individual to communicate with the entire world just by setting up a website. So it promised truly democratic sharing of information. And since it's happened, really, it's become a war. It's become a war between democratic sharing of information against pushing it back to what it was, which was an autocratic system. And over the last 25 years, we've seen some very powerful entities develop, and nearly all internet traffic now is administered or is handled via these entities. And I don't think it's healthy. What I think is healthy is people setting up their own websites and communicating with many, many websites and getting information independently, rather than using corporate websites. Because I think the net effect of these corporate websites is to just push the system back to an autocratic system where the influence goes in one direction. And we've got some rather sinister entities behind some of the more cuddly entities on the internet. So we know that intelligence agencies, we know GCHQ run vast number of projects online, private companies. Neil Sanders was talking about Cambridge Analytica months before it was revealed in mainstream media. If you're rich enough, you can also manipulate the internet. And also visible government now are threatening to bring in laws to control the internet, and they're using the excuse of social media to do it. So time's up for immoral web giants. So they want to bring in laws against democratic use of the internet. Now, you might say, well, no, the information does flow in two directions. It's not one directional. Well, it's the influence that I think is in one direction, not the information. You submit information to Facebook and to Google when you do searches, but that information is then used in a subversive way. Let me just illustrate this with regards to Google, how Google actually works. This comes from a viewer. I work with the eBay search engine, but I was formally trained and expected to be working with the Google search engine. I was trained to be a judge for Google UK results, but they gave me the eBay job instead, though I passed the Google training. The company I have a contract with is Appin Butler Hill. A group of judges from specific regions have access to a portal. We are given real user search queries. The Google engine will provide a random return result. The portal will give us random results of the competing search engines. It is then our job to ascertain if the returned result was relevant or not to the query. There are pages and pages of guidelines that must be adhered to when making a judgment. If there are, say, 20 judges in the UK doing this, and the query is for Madeleine McCann, if the random returned result was your website or video, we would be encouraged to mark the result as not relevant. So that's page one of Google, right? What gets on page one of Google is just being decided by a bunch of people. It's not done automatically by some algorithm, right? And they've got guidelines which say they must favor mainstream sources. This is due to the strict guidelines stating that sources like the BBC or Daily Mail are more trustworthy sources of information. What they would term as fringe or conspiracy sources, we are told to flag or mark as not relevant. So there's no actual test. There's no one trying to find out what the truthful sources are. They're just assuming that mainstream must be more truthful. This judgment and the relevant recorded data is from many people. If 90% of judgments mark BBC as most relevant, and I mark your site as highly relevant, I would receive bad feedback and risk my job if I continued to go against the mass judgments. So you can argue that the system, by doing that, is pushing it more back to an autocratic system, because all Google are doing is sending people to corporate websites, and we're back to the system of newspapers that we were at. Now, the other thing that's happening is, I think that the internet is being attacked and being, someone's dropping big dirty turds into the internet when it's been used in a democratic way. So some of that might be termed fake news, but it's more, it goes wider than just fake news. If you just look at YouTube videos now, there's so many YouTube videos which to me seem deliberately misleading, but it seems orchestrated to me. It's not just someone making a genuine mistake over factual information. There seems to be a plot behind it, I would suggest. You could argue that the social media sites themselves are just big turds popping up on the internet. So watch out for those turds when you're surfing the internet. It really is becoming difficult now. But the purveyors of fake news are the mainstream sites. This is still up on the BBC website from 13th of September. A totally fake story. The most important story this century, right? And the BBC have written an entirely fake article about it, and it's still there. And they point their fingers at fake news on the internet. Right, I'm going to show you a clip of Yuri Bezmenov, and he's talking about subversion, right, in general. But I'm going to apply what he's saying to what's going on the internet and what the internet is now being used for.
You see, the tactic of subversion, about which I'm talking, is similar to the martial art, the Japanese martial art. If some of you are familiar with that tactic, probably you will remember that if an enemy is bigger and heavier than yourself, it would be very painful to resist his direct strike. If a heavier person wants to strike me in the face, it would be very naive and counterproductive to stop his blow. The Chinese and Japanese judo art tells us what to do. First to avoid the strike, then to grab the fist and continue his movement in the direction where it was before, right? Until the enemy crashes in the wall. The moment all these movements will be directed in one direction, right? This is the time to catch that movement and to continue it until the movement forces the whole society into collapse, into crisis, right? So that's exactly the martial art tactic. We don't stop an enemy. We let him go. We help him to go in the direction we want them to go.
So what I'm saying is somebody is using the internet for the kind of thing that Yuri Bezmenov is talking about there. And to illustrate the point, I've drawn this truthometer. Right now, we know that mainstream media will regularly push false narratives, right? Mainstream push a false narrative. The Skripal case is an example. There are hundreds of others. So that means that, by definition, the truth would be defined as a conspiracy. But you will always find on the internet now what I've termed wild conspiracies, conspiracies for which there's no real evidence, right? And what Yuri Bezmenov is saying is, look, these guys are a threat because they're finding out the truth and they're exposing us, right? So don't oppose them and bring them back to mainstream. You never do that. What he's saying is, just push them a little bit towards a more wild conspiracy. That's how we're going to deal with these bastards who are finding the truth. We're going to push them towards a less credible conspiracy position, right? And this is what the flat earth videos are, folks. I'm sorry if you believe the earth is flat, right? But that's what's going on here.